Darcy, I want to stick with you with this one. The first independent review into the RBA came out last week, as we know. It recommended splitting the RBA board into two separate boards, one focused just on monetary policy. Andrew, there's now criticisms that the current board has lacked the knowledge to actually challenge the RBA governor's judgment when it came to setting the cash rate. How concerning is that the RBA board may not have or didn't or doesn't have the expertise to actually set the cash rate?
Yeah, well, I think there's some merit in some of those criticisms, but not all as well. I mean, you wouldn't want the exact opposite as well, though, where you just got a board full of economic geniuses that have no real-world experience and no business acumen. I mean, the stacking of the RBA board with business heads began in the 1990s. So it has been a long custom of federal governments to put people with real-world experience in there. But yes, you do need a balance, because the board got made some considerable missteps in terms of monetary policy in its approach to inflation, particularly on what they assumed was going to be a wage explosion, which never eventuated. It never has. They've always talked about it, but it never arrives. So there needs to be a bit more of a balanced approach about who's going on. A mix of people with real-world experience that have captains of industries, both from a business point of view and right across the economy, but also those that are attuned to the macroeconomics and the monetary policy settings that are, quite frankly, becoming more complex as we go along, and particularly made more complex by COVID-19.
Yeah. I find it astonishing that they have the first independent review into the operations of the RBA and its board in decades, and it comes back and says, oh yeah, it turns out they don't really know what they're doing. Which is basically what it has said. That's right. Yeah. And it so happens, I've been listening to this, because I listen to a lot of podcasts because I'm that weird guy, but about how basically this tension between either going for full employment or going for low inflation has been the driver of and it's usually a kind of conservative progressive. The progressives want full employment. Conservatives are more worried about inflation, but or capital. People who are worried about capital are worried about high inflation. And it's amazing. This has just defined the entire 20th century. And it just seems strange that we're now at the beginning of the 21st century and we're just starting to think about giving the RBA those kinds of powers. It's a really weird one.
Well, I covered this topic, that conflict between focusing on inflation or full employment on my show the day that the RBA review came out last week, and pointed out very early on, 5 o'clock after it was handed out, that there was already this concern among senior economists that the RBA should not be changing focus to take on full employment. It should just stick with its goal of inflation. Otherwise, you could end up with entrenched inflation if you're setting cash rates to worry about employment.
Yeah, that's right. You don't want to politicise inflation. Basically, you don't want to politicise interest rates.
It's got one mechanism to play with, the interest rates, and one objective, inflation, and that's where it should stay. Anyway.
Love it. As usual, you heard it here first.